and co-director of the Education Policy Innovation Collaborative, EPIC, from 2016 to 2020. From 2015 to 2018, he served as co-editor of Educational Evaluation and Policy Analysis, and he's also been the associate editor of Education, Finance, and Policy. He remains on the editorial boards of both journals. His current research focuses on teacher quality, student and teacher mobility, and evaluations of state and local education programs. And not surprisingly, Josh's work is well published and well funded. And especially important to us here is that Josh is an NEPC fellow, and we look to him as an especially knowledgeable and capable expert. Particularly relevant to today's talk is that he's also written for several national media outlets. And in fact, earlier this year, he wrote a piece for Time magazine in which he explained how voucher programs hurt students. And with that said, I'm going to let him now tell you more about how to speak with non-researchers about vouchers.
Great. Well, thank you for that introduction. It's both very kind and a good. I need to update some tenses in that bio, wherever that came from. Because much of the last 18 months of my time has been occupied by this issue, and it was an issue that I sort of spent the first 8 or 9 years of my career on. Thought it was over, like a lot of folks, and maybe others who were more prescient than I was. But I really bought into the notion of evidence-based public policy in education, and on the evidence and on the data, these things that we're about to talk about would have died 5 years ago, is my view. I mean, we don't get a lot of clear pictures in social science, and this is about as clear as one gets, just setting aside all the other stuff that Kevin mentioned, and then I'll drop into today too. But it's good to see everybody. I know many of you, and it's been a while, I think, since I've seen some of you in person. So I'm going to go ahead and just jump to this, and I will go through this because I don't have a full half hour, but I would love to hear some direct conversation. We have a chance for that, maybe 10-15 minutes at the end before we go into that bigger group. So I'm going to share my screen once I figure out where my presentation is. Here we go. So can everybody see my screen here?
Yes.
All right. So I was asked to talk about talking about vouchers with non-researchers, and I should say that I can barely even run a PowerPoint. So I think if you know, just both from the bio, if you know who I am, if a couple of you have worked with me for a while, like, you know, I'm by nothing resembling a comms professional, and I have not had formal training in that, but I have been fortunate enough to have worked in my career sort of both inside voucher evaluations in the early years, which inform a lot of what I talk about today, both today and in general. And I know a lot of these guys who are saying some stuff right now, and I know how some of these programs have been created from the inside, but also elements like journal editing, right? Elements like building a research practice partnership, having to talk to legislators, policymakers, governor's offices, stakeholders, and things like that. A lot of that just kind of dumps into the way that I think through this issue. And so I think in some sense, what I have to say here is really just kind of informed by that. But I want to kind of make that caveat, right? Like I certainly am not a communications professional. I think that's pretty obvious. So that said, there are some things that I have learned along the way. I want to go through those really fast. And then I'm just going to show you really quickly the pieces of the webinar that I give to stakeholder groups, to legislators, and to journalists across the country. And I'm going to go through that webinar pretty quickly because many of you have seen pieces that, if you follow me on social media, read any of my public writing. So I will not go as slowly as I would in a normal version, but I'll sort of show you what I mean after I give you these few sort of pieces that I've learned. And this is some of this is more general beyond vouchers, but specifically to vouchers themselves. So the first thing is, like, I dispense with the tediousness of arguing about names. All of these things that we've talked about across the states are school vouchers. If it involves public money, either through a direct appropriation or through a tax credit system, it's a voucher to private schools. We've known for 20 years, right, that there's been a lot of pushback to using this word. In this public voice that I've developed, I've learned a lot of new "it's not a voucher" descriptions. My favorite one is that these days is if it doesn't take any money from school aid fund and only uses money from some other part of general fund dollars, it's not a voucher, which doesn't make any sense to me. Point being, I don't litigate this. When someone calls me, whether it's a journalist, a stakeholder, a legislator, whatever, it's a voucher, and we're moving on, and we're going to talk about what these results show. I tried to put some professional academic structure on what I just said in a piece for Brookings a few weeks ago, well, mid-August at this point, just sort of saying, here's why the literature on vouchers informs these new ESAs. 2/3, at the absolute minimum, 2/3 of spending from these new ESA programs is on classic traditional voucher style programs. In Arizona, that's the bare minimum, 2/3. In Iowa, also a so-called ESA, you can only spend the ESA dollars on tuition or specific fees related to private school attendance, like uniforms, transportation, textbooks. So there's really, really no difference. It's just differs in what's a qualified or allowable educational expense. I try not to tell, I try to show, and you'll see the webinar I'm going to show up you in a second is called Vouchers and Pictures. There's not a lot of words. It's just headlines, a graph from one of our friends at Indiana, some graphs that I've helped make, but it's showing local context does matter in some of these cases, but I have in the parameters that policymakers, researchers, and legislators might need to know about: caps on spending, restrictions on eligibility, sunset, hold harmless clauses, and then oversight's the big one. Those are sources of variation across the states, but it is uncanny how closely each bill resembles each other. So the national trends are super relevant. I have found that talking about national issues is more or less welcome depending on the state that I'm talking to. But everybody understands that this is a national push. And so more often than not exclusively, but more often than not, I have found that talking about these issues as part of a larger national movement tends to give some credibility to local stakeholders when they say this. None of this has anything to do with our kids here in our districts or our state. This is all about this national push. I do think it's important to ask who's asking you questions, whether you're talking to a journalist, whether you're talking to a stakeholder group, whatever. Stakeholders in red states are fighting a different kind of thing. Like, the bill could really pass. Talk to a lot of editorial boards, journalists with a take, whether they're sort of, say the Houston Chronicle, they're going to write an opinion piece, but they are journalists that are trying to get the story right, as opposed to, say, I don't know, well, there are a lot of right-wing groups, for example, that also have a take that aren't all that interested in getting the story right. Talk to a lot of folks these days that are just actually trying to inform content, which means they're going to call. I know within 3 people who they're going to call after they talk to me. It's going to be Josh, then it's going to be Corey DeAngelis, or it's going to be somebody, right? They are going to do that, and you have to understand that and talk to that and not try to, just accept that it is going to be a both sides type coverage. And then increasingly, and this is speaking if any of you folks are either aware of or working already in Pennsylvania, for example, the needs and the issues that the stakeholders in blue states right now, they're dealing with something different, because it really could go either way. And you're not necessarily trying to give kind of it's very different to try to talk about what a voucher program that is going to pass might look like if it's evidence-based, and if you're trying to kind of just from a good governance standpoint do less harm than if you're actually trying to give information to folks who are still trying to stop something. Those are 2 different exercises, and they might be asking you different things. And to reflect, right? I think this is good for all of us as teachers that, what's important to me may be less important to others. And to be responsive to some of those direct questions, but to stress the message that you came to the table to deliver. For me, it's a 4-point thing, and that's it. Vouchers fund mostly kids who are already in private school, or at least have never been in public school. For the few kids who do switch, we see some of the largest academic drops on record. The reason for those drops is straightforward. It's because vouchers mostly prop up struggling subprime provider schools. They're not giving access to elite academies. And increasingly, the reason, despite all that rich evidence, the reason these things are persisting today is that they're part of this broader religious nationalist push, ban books, marginalize LGBTQ families, change the way we talk about race, and eliminate reproductive freedom. All of those things, I should have added rolling back protections to child labor in Arkansas and Iowa. All of those things have happened in the same 13 months that all of these the so-called year of universal choice has happened. You got all these folks at EdChoice and Paul Peterson just had a conference last week, just sort of doing a victory dance. Well, all of those things have happened while other really awful things have been going on in other realms and sectors, and all of it's part of the same thing. In some cases, the same folks are doing it. So, it is nonsensical to ask in a vacuum, why vouchers? Why are we having all this conversation now without asking those other questions? And that's a really important part of the story that I have to tell. So whipping through this webinar, and I think you'll see some of what I've just tried to put on those first couple slides, show not tell, right? These are the kinds of pictures that I show when I talk to folks. I start right from the beginning with defining a voucher. Everything we're talking about is a voucher. We can talk ESA, we can say ESA vouchers, we can try to split the difference. If it's using public dollars, either through a direct appropriation or through the tax credit process, to fund private tuition, it's a voucher. End of story, let's move on. When I said that, listen to what others find important. So when I first started talking about this issue in a really public and insistent way, if you read some of my writing from 10 or 12 years ago when I'm coming up in the profession and talking about all these exit rates for kids in voucher programs, or how important we need oversight for these programs, like a lot of the critical pieces that I stressed today were seeded 10 or 12 years ago, before the catastrophic academic results came on record in Indiana, Louisiana, DC, and Ohio. But because I came up through this sort of RPP framework, which big data, longitudinal data, for state educational agencies like the one I was partnering with, and many of you have worked with, test scores, whatever our criticism of them are still coin of the realm. And that is what, if you're talking to a state chief and an SEA or whatever, they are going to ask you about the test score content. And so when I first got active in this space, if you look at my first kind of more public writing in the last 18 months, it started with the test score issue, because of how awful those results have been for kids who do transfer. I mean, -4 to -5 standard deviations at the high end of this. That's almost twice what the COVID-19 pandemic has done more recently. I thought that was the lead headline. And I still, to some extent, sort of because of my background, often stress it, as you'll see in a second. But when I really started talking about this in a public way, this was the issue, that 3/4 or more of voucher users were already in private school, or at least had never been in public school. And that was the salient piece over and over and over and over again, both to journalists, to stakeholders I was talking about in the field, and to legislators. They cared about the test score piece, but this was the one that they really, really spoke to them about. And so this is what I lead with today. The other thing I'd lead with, and it's partly to try to encourage journalists who I talk to ask these questions, but it also comes from my own background, knowing how data are collected and what type of longitudinal data state educational agencies and treasury departments need to function. It is idiotic, sorry to use the word, but all of what we know about this issue, with one exception, that's Wisconsin, comes from investigative reporting. 75%, 69%, less than a third, 60%, so on and so forth. These are questions that have been pried out of SEAs in red states mostly by journalists. It shouldn't take Chalkbeat or whoever this should be part of a public report every year, in my view. It has to, I don't buy, Arkansas for a long time was trying to tell journalists, we don't collect this data. We're not collecting it as part of our rollout for the Learns bill. That's nonsense, right? They need these data. They need to know where the kid's coming from to run the program. So I'm trying to stress this issue moving forward. Look at how uncannily similar. About 3 out of every 4 kids were never in public school. But why are you asking the department? Why isn't the department releasing this information? That's something that I think is really important moving forward. I don't know if Chris Lubianski's on this call, but his team at Indiana put together this graph in a policy brief in November. As soon as I saw it, I knew that it had to be a big piece of my set of talking points and try to cite Chris every chance I get. Because you hear these voucher advocates say things like, well, it's mixed results. And that sounds easy to report on. And it's also satisfying if you're kind of a mainstream reporter or a legislator, right? Mixed results. It's just a bunch of academics, Cowen fighting Pat Wolf or something about what the same results actually say. The results aren't mixed. It's a simple story. The bigger and the more recent the voucher program, the worse the results. The bigger and the more recent the voucher program, the worse results. And Chris's graph does a really, really good job showing that. But not everybody likes standard deviations. So about 20 months ago, 18 months ago, I put out this call on social media. And I said, one of those like Hive Twitter things. What are some of the other things that have, because negative 0.4 standard deviations, right? Even if you don't want to talk in those terms, it's catastrophically large. It's really hard to find an intervention in a positive direction that's that big. We need to be as humble, right, as policy researchers. We can't move the needle always that well. What kinds of things have moved the needle in this direction? And virtual charter schools aren't on this list, but they're up there. But you really have to go to a natural disaster, the COVID-19 pandemic and Hurricane Katrina, to get anything resembling some of these awful results. So when I talk about those test score effects, I do talk about comparisons. And I don't get into this whole, like, is it 3 months worth of learning or 6 months? Let's just benchmark it with stuff everybody understands. That COVID really hurt kids academically, and that so did Hurricane Katrina, and vouchers are on par with those 2 disasters. These are persistent effects. The DeVos type organizations are really big on this. We just need to give these programs time. They have not improved with time. This is something that I've stressed sort of because it was intellectually appealing to me, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, coming out of Milwaukee, where we saw these huge exit rates. Remains true today, even as voucher programs grow in total usage for the individual child. The duration of these programs is still very short. It's a revolving door, and this is not random attrition from voucher programs. They tend to be students who are lower scoring to begin with academically, students who come from lower income family background, and students of color. And we don't know always why they're leaving these programs either within or between school years, but we know those are the students disproportionately likely to do so, even in the old programs where these were income based and things like that. So I do not celebrate school closures, no matter what sector, vouchers, charters, whatever. It's devastating for kids, and I don't celebrate high exit rates. This is not Burger King where you can just shop for a burger that you want and change your mind 3 weeks later. This is a negative result. And if you sort of have some experience with school funding and things like that too, this has some implications for how you fund the program. At minimum, it tells you need to pay these things in installments, not in yearly payments to schools. I like to point out, I'm not the only one who knows this. One of the reasons that the voucher programs that we talk about today don't have any oversight provisions whatsoever, no requirements to meet the same standards for academic testing at minimum as public schools, is that everybody on that side knows it. When she was a public official, Betsy DeVos had to answer for it. And they blamed overregulation, not subprime prop ups, but these folks know it, and we need to be better about just calling them out on that. I like to stress that we know the average survival time for typical voucher schools is pretty short. In Wisconsin, where it's been the longest program, 40% of schools have closed since the program began. The average time to closure is much shorter for the newer schools, those pop-up schools that open to feed new supply. So whenever you hear somebody say today, it's all about supply, we just need to stand up new suppliers for schools, those schools close very frequently, and that's why we see the test score results that we see in the data. There's actually been some good academic work on this question, but I like to lead with this banner on Fordham, because Fordham, back before this big conservative re-push on this, Fordham was really actually moving against vouchers as a right of center group. They really were sort of doubling down on charters and their investment in that in places like Ohio. Well, I don't know the internal politics of why they've switched to be more gently supportive of vouchers now, again, but they got really behind some of the evidence coming out of the states on school failure. So I'm pointing to their reporting on this, even though it's also backed up by academic versions of some of this stuff. You don't like Fordham, you don't like Betsy DeVos, you don't like academic studies. GAO has done some work, not so much on the test score stuff, but on eligibility requirements. They found that the vendors that run these voucher programs, especially in DC where they have more oversight, but elsewhere too, are really bad about communicating things like eligibility, the restrictions, the protections one gives up when one leaves a voucher program. So I point this out as well from time to time. One of the things that I also say is try to remember that phrases do stick out to people. So the idea that when it comes to school vouchers, it really is the school's choice. It's not school choice. It's not parental choice. It's the school's choice. Best evidence I can show for that, it's not just on students with disabilities, but sadly, outrageously, maddeningly, many of these programs are used today to discriminate against LGBTQ children and families. It's taken, again, investigative reporting. It's not been something researchers have been able to find because of some of the limitations on the data. But this headline's 5 years old now. 16 million and counting went to Indiana's voucher schools with overt. I mean, think about what they have to know to do this. Stuff that they put on their websites, phone calls to principals, folks that are leaning into anti-LGBTQ language, not trying to cover it up with something quieter. And same applies to students with disabilities at this point. If you've ever worked in state sort of oversight on issues of discipline, on issues of enrollment, on issues of discrimination, you know there's a lot more attention paid to the front end, to the admissions and the enrollment side of things, and there's not as much attention paid to the back end. So what these schools do over time, they'll admit many more people, and then they'll quietly exit them within a few weeks. And researchers can inform some of that, but often you need some investigative reporting to help with that too. And then I sort of like to end the conversation, whether it's this webinar or whether sort of I'm talking to somebody one-on-one, with just some reminders of where else all of this is fitting in the larger narrative. The Heritage Foundation's been a good source of that information over time over last year, because they've been really leaning in, not just trying to push out. They've gone at me a couple times. They've gone at folks like Jen Jennings a couple times on some data and some numbers. But what they're really trying to do on a day-to-day basis is shore up constituency support for these programs in red states. And so you'll see reports coming out like empowering parents with school choice reduces wokeism, and actually trying to correlate data and metrics and things on some woke measure and things like that. So it's one of those good examples for how to tell an agenda story with statistics. But make no mistake, I think everybody knows this on this call, but not everybody else does. Make no mistake that all of the efforts we're seeing are related to this larger culture war push. And that is one of the big reasons why these things are still persisting. It's really the dominant reason why these things are still persisting, despite some of the worst evidence lined up against them that you can see in social science, in my view. A couple citations, always try to get those in, especially for Chris's team, but also for the folks who helped create the graphics. And that's kind of what I got. It was a little bit more than 15 minutes, I guess, but yeah, I don't know if anybody wants to chat briefly or stop share. Let's try that.
Hey Josh, this is Arnie Danzig. I don't know if you can hear me okay.
I can, yeah, hi.
Hi. Hey, so Emma, Gordon Laffer is an NAPC fellow who's written a lot about charters, wrote a chapter for us. We have a new book with Bill Black and Zorka coming out on charters in California, Florida, and Arizona. And a couple of fellows here have contributed to it as well. David Garcia has written a chapter. He's got a great metaphor or analogy. And let me read it from his chapter. He says, imagine if the transportation department announced that it would no longer plan what roads to build, but instead would allow any private contractor that wanted to build a road. Cars would be tracked by GPS and the state transportation budget would be doled out on a per car mile basis to whatever privately owned roads people chose to use. Let them vote with their steering wheels. If 6 different companies all decided to build a freeway from LA to San Diego, even though travel showed that traffic was sufficient to sustain only 2 such roads, no problem. Whoever ends up being most attractive will win, and the others will gradually be abandoned and crumbled to dust. It's conceivable that the state might distribute hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars in such an untargeted fashion, but this is frighteningly close to what we are doing to our school system. That was a great analogy.
I agree.
Perhaps on that analogy, we should head off to our small groups.
Well, I see a couple of questions still. I think we got a couple minutes left, don't we?
I have a quick question, if that's okay.
Sure.
Yep.
Go for
Hey,
it.
Josh. It's always good to see you, Josh.
Yeah, good to see you.
For this presentation, I had a quick question. So you mentioned that roughly 20% of students leave voucher programs, but that we don't exactly know why. Do you know of any researchers or existing research who have conducted a qualitative study to hear from the students and the families on why they've left?
I do not, and I would welcome any corrections to that. Folks in New Orleans, where I've worked, and some of the others on this group have done some work on kind of why one stays more generally without asking like the direct question, why did you leave? But what are the kinds of things that you continue to be important throughout your educational journey, that sort of thing. But no, I'm not aware of that, and I think it should happen. If David Garcia, do you have a?
I do, Josh. So Josh, I'm on the ground here in Arizona.
Yeah.
A program level discussion is just simply not happening, period. This is very much, look, you can throw as much data as you want to out there, but if I believe it works for me and my kid,
Yep.
And the story, there is no larger discussion here. I go back to, I just think that that's where we should be spending some time and energy, is at that level, because that's the discussion here. I go back to Julie Mead years ago and this idea of parent choice as a circuit breaker. Arnie, if I choose that road and I'm a parent, who's government to tell me that it's a bad idea? And that's a really tough place to be. I just think that for us as a group, we should spend some time and energy at that micro grain level, because that is the discussion going on right now, without question, in Arizona. Your kid, your tax money, your decision, period.
I would say I agree. And I think that is important for folks to work on. I get a lot of calls from like policy directors or legislative staff and governor's offices and things. And like, they are trying to pass bills or modify existing ones, right? So they still are talking about the program level. And I've found that just shooting down some of the basic ideas that, like, for example, these are lifelines from failing public schools and things like that. Like, a lot of folks, particularly on the East and West Coast, frankly, just qualitatively is my sense, who maybe have some experience in private schools themselves or whatever, really can't get out of the mindset. They may defend public education, but they can't get out of the mindset that in general, private schools are better. And that's a really tough thing to knock down if you are talking to a policymaker who's on the fence and may want to sign the bill or right. And so those two pieces of information that no, in fact, most kids using these programs are already in private school. So they're not even in a public school, number one. And number two, when they do transfer, it actually has on average catastrophic effects. I agree that what the parents' decision is an important one, but I still think there are plenty of policymakers who have a say in this, and they are often reached not just through direct contact. I don't lobby. I'm not a lobbyist. I'm a professor, right? But also through how it's covered in the media.
Well, Josh, if you got a way to help a policymaker override a parent's decision, I'd love to hear it, because I've never seen a good one here in Arizona. I just haven't.
I would say it starts with
You know
making sure Katie Hobbs isn't invested in the program. That's a really important stakeholder that we need to keep speaking to.
And she keeps funding him. She lost it. I mean, she lost that battle over there.
You know what? I'm going to call us now. I'm really excited that we're having such an interesting conversation, and I hope that will persist in the small groups. This is really wonderful. Thank you so much, Josh. And we'll see everybody back right now.
Thanks for listening. Appreciate it.